much. I'll try not to shut up for the next hour. Perhaps you'll shut me up when the time comes. It's true that I've sort of been interested in all sorts of... I can't stop talking because I'm interested in all sorts of questions which come up. And I have been very, very interested recently by work on children, especially on the cognitive development of children. And I'm going to try to show how that can come together with much more classical anthropological questions. Perhaps not my starting point is one which probably is familiar to many of you, especially in this building, which is the work that's been done in Leipzig by people like Michael Tomasello and lots of his collaborators. Well, what they've done is that they've tried to follow very, very closely the development of young chimpanzees and young humans to see when and where and if there's much difference. And indeed, I mean, there doesn't really seem to be much difference in conceptual knowledge between young chimpanzees and young humans until about 18 months. Very, very similar. But there are a couple of things which are different. They're rather nice as far as we're concerned. One of them is that young humans about the age of 18 months are sort of helpful. They really do like to help. He has a nice experiment where he shows us there's a small child sitting in a room who watches a man putting, I think, their old newspapers inside the cupboard. And every time the child picks up the news, tries to help the experimenter who's putting the newspapers in the cupboard. And that's something which chimpanzees don't do at all. You know, this is the idea that almost a drive to be helpful. So that's one thing. It's not something I'll be talking very much about, partly because Mike Tomasello has been talking about it endlessly for the last 10 years or so. But the other thing is that young children go in for what's been called in the psychological literature pretend play. I'm sure if any of you have been close or have young children, in my case young grandchildren, you'll know what I'm talking about. From about 18 months, probably even before, sort of infants sort of like to play games. You know, for example, an example is always given, but it's one which is common enough, that you get a child who picks up a banana and talks into it as though it's a phone, and laughs, knowing that it's not a phone. That kind of pretend play is extremely common. And it very rapidly develops into something which is more complex. That is what one might call role play. That I'm thinking of a particular infant I saw actually just last week, putting nappies on her teddy bear. So in other words, what the child is doing is, I am mummy, and the teddy bear is me. Indeed, the teddy bear is, in this particular case, was being addressed as baby, which was the term which that child used for herself. So you have this sort of an elaboration of this sort of pretend play in young children. And it actually goes even further that, I mean, obviously slightly older children, but they begin to sort of join in pretend play. That they will together say, you know, I'm the teacher, you're the pupil, the very typical one, and both of them play the role. Perhaps there was a fight about who's going to be the teacher, but sometimes not, or indeed elaborate pretend play with saying this brick is a motor car and asking the other child, will you go and put a bit of petrol in it, and the other child goes along, says, this sort of thing. So you're getting not just pretending, but you're getting a kind of system of pretense, which children, sort of, I was going to say, sort of engage in almost automatically. There's a bit of discussion in literature whether it's automatic or whether they need a bit of stimulation to go in for this, you know, a bit of encouragement from parents or adults. I don't think it makes much difference, because even if it's a matter of stimulation, they love it and they pick it up really fast. So that's something, that's another thing, a second thing, which these very young children, very young humans do, which marks them off very, very clearly from chimpanzees. And this is, I mean, it's very systematically studied quite a lot in Leipzig, but it's been known for a long time. And quite a lot of people have tried to come up with various explanations of why is it that human kids really go in for this sort of thing. I mean, it's sort of Freud, actually even Piaget, who should have known better, sort of thought that they were, you know, the very young kids were sort of living in a fantasy, sort of semi-magical world, and that's why they were doing this. But actually, I mean, it's very difficult to think of anything more wrong. I mean, everything we know about the young children, very young children, is that they're sort of hyper-rational. They go in for more fancy stuff later on. Actually, Freud actually thought it was a kind of disease of very early children, which then popped up later on in life. But actually, not to engage in pretend play is a very worrying sign of potential real psychological trouble later on, so it's exactly the opposite. Then you've had sort of suggestions that it's a kind of early sort of scientific experimentation, you see, it's sort of saying, you know, like in sort of scientific thought, what if things were like other than they are, as a kind of exploration of the world, a kind of intellectual exploration of the world. There's been sort of, some people sort of see it as linked with the beginning of language, because of course that's exactly the age when kids begin to learn language. Other explanations which that it's got to do something to do with the social, that it's a kind of early learning of how to behave as a social individual, because of course one of the things which seems very clear is that one of the driving forces in evolution which has made humans so different from chimpanzees is the complication of the kind of human social organization which we've got, and those other animals which seem to be also very clever like us are probably very clever for very similar reasons, but have to deal with very complicated social problems. Now actually I apart from the ones of Piaget and Freud, I have quite a lot of sympathy with all those, and indeed I don't think they will go against the kind of way I'm trying to think about it. But I think they're rather insufficient. And what I would like to stress when I'm about this pretend playing, which is so characteristic of humans. By the way, I didn't say, but it's not just in the West, or whatever it is, that kids go in for pretend play. But where they go in exactly the same age is not very clear. We don't have much description from other places, but there's some description in sort of parts of Brazil. There's somebody called, Marilyn probably know who it is, Watson Guerrero, who worked in New Guinea. I don't know, perhaps I'm right in saying the name wrong. Who describes that sort of thing. There isn't actually, you know, some anthropologists don't go in much for looking at 18-month-old kids, which is a pity. It's jolly difficult to do it if you're doing sort of normal anthropological field work. Anyway, so go back, it seems to me that in a way these explanations are probably right, but they're somewhat insufficient. One of the things which is really, which when you think about it is going on in pretend play, is the ability to maintain two registers at the same time. The child who is playing at putting the nappies on the teddy bear is maintaining both her role as mummy with an imagination. The teddy bear is her. Doesn't matter if there's that, but in this particular case, I'm thinking of it, that was so. And at the same time, I am mummy, but I'm myself, and the two things are going on at the same time. Otherwise, a child wouldn't be able to handle the thing very well. So you're having two levels simultaneously occurring, which is really quite a feat, if you think about it. And one of the things that's interesting about talking about it like that is that it seems to be linked with another very characteristic human capacity, which is what's sometimes been called meta-representations. But perhaps one of the, there are a number of them. They're very, I'll argue later on that we're always meta-representing, but that's, I'm just getting ahead of myself. If you think of our ability to use irony, for example, you know, both to be ironic and to hear that the other person is ironic, that requires sort of maintaining two levels at the same time. You know, you're supposing that I'm the irony producer. I'm saying something which is at a literal level, but that has to be being processed. And also at another level at the same time, which is probably saying almost exactly the opposite. So, you know, we're all able to play at irony. We're able to, obviously with metaphors, we're doing the same thing, with maintaining two levels at the same time, synchronically. Indeed, we're even doing it when you do things, when it's a matter of sort of citation. You know, if I sort of say, Mary told me that she'd gone shopping. So I'm maintaining, you know, I'm sort of creating Mary saying to me, I'm gone shopping, and then there's me there hearing it. So there's sort of these two levels being maintained. And I would argue that even things like sort of really weird, exotic things, I mean the things I've just mentioned are going on all the time, but things, you know, like spirit possession, for example. If you're watching somebody being possessed in spirit possession, I don't know if any of you have seen that, you see the possessed person and the spirit which is possessing her at the same time. I mean, people say it's just a spirit, of course, but actually the experience, the phenomenology of the experience is seeing this person double, both as the spirit and as the medium at the same time. So I mean, that's an extreme case, but that phenomena of seeing, handling simultaneously two levels, indeed even sometimes more, but just not to make things too complicated, I'm just going to just talk about two of them, is very, very characteristic of human beings. And it seems that it does somehow to link up with this pretend playing, which also involves, you see, the ability to be seen at two levels. You know, so the child is, let's say, both being mummy and herself at the same time. That's why I'm so interested in it. It's very fascinating here to watch kids doing this, because very, very skilled, very, very fast. You need to get skilled at doing this before they really develop much in terms of their linguistic ability. And when they're doing it, they're showing you very well that they're not, that they're playing at these two levels, usually by sort of laughter, which actually Watson Giguere describes also. It's not, they're indicating by various sort of micro signs, or macro ones often by Giguere, that they're not, they're not becoming mummy completely. They're becoming mummy and not being mummy at the same time. There's very good descriptions of this in the literature. So, the first thing is to say, well, first of all, it's very interesting that human beings do this, because, I mean, after all, it is interesting what is one of these key separation points between young chimps and young humans. And also it's interesting because it seems to link up with some really quite fundamental capacities of human cognition to be at least more than one level simultaneously. And when I sort of think about it, all this sort of somewhat reminds me of a bit of sort of social science theory. I think what I mean I can sort of explain to you by giving you an example which I've used elsewhere, which is in the village in Madagascar where I've been doing research for a very long time. There's an old man there who I know very, very well. Some of you may have heard me talk a bit about him before. One of the things about this old man is that I've known him for more than 30 years. He used to be quite a sort of powerful person. He managed to get himself into the position of being an elder who blesses everybody in the village, and who takes a sort of ritual position in terms of the big rituals which go on in the village. But now he's really, well, he's just sort of in a state of rapid physical and mental collapse. And most of the time he just sort of sits there in a corner, just sort of huddled up, sort of blanket, filthy blanket around him. He can't move around much. He hardly says anything at all. And when he does, it's sort of, you can't really sort of understand him. He shows signs that, I mean, I wouldn't say of sort of advanced senility, but he shows signs of senility, all right. He also especially sort of shows signs of sort of basically giving up on life. I think that's one of the characteristics that he is. And by the time, people just pass in front of him as though he wasn't there, or from a lot of the time. They move him around and taking his dinner, so he spills it all over himself and things, so you can imagine the scene. But he's also treated simultaneously with extreme respect. These certain aspects of, when people pass in front of him, they walk in front of him. By the way Madagascar pass in front of somebody important, which you're doing this, is that you're sort of separating the water, separating the way, and then with your much lower. They even ask him for his advice at certain times, although you can't really understand much of what he says. And whenever there are rituals to take place, he then has the central role, even though he's a bit helped in terms of what to do. Though he actually manages it, strangely enough, sort of. I mean, somewhat sort of comes to life when he's put in these rituals. Now, one of the things which is very striking about this is that as I see him now, last time I was actually talking in this room, I actually was talking about him, I actually showed a photograph of him as he is, not quite as he is now, the other kind, but as he was not very long ago, is that he also is double. He's both a sort of completely weak old man who's, let's say, on the process of dying, who stinks, and so on. And he's treated like that. And people even make fun of him. Yet he's also, at the same time, simultaneously, this elder, this person in that great system of genealogy, of blessing, of transmission, of the enablement of life. I'm sort of using a more or less Madagascar phrase, the enablement of life. So he's two people. It's very tempting to say, well, look, he's two people as a matter of switching. You know, there's lots of literature that talks about you switch from one register to another. But actually, and I've written a bit like that, but I think that's wrong. He's simultaneously both those things, both those roles. And of course, if you think about his role as an elder, as an elder, he's part of a system. I mean, he's part of the system, you know, being an elder in the role of being an elder. He's in relationship to juniors who are in the roles of being juniors, of affines who are in the role of being affines, of grandchildren, of ancestors who are dead, but who is transmitting this power to maintain life through. So that side of him as an elder is part of a complicated, invisible way, system, which coexists with him as an old man who one sort of laughs at and who kids sort of go, when they go by. Now, I suppose one temptation would be to say, well, in a sense, he's both represented as an imaginary figure, as part of an imaginary system, as well as what he is empirically. The two things go together. But if you think about it, I mean, both are sort of representations, both are phenomenological representations which are going on, both for him and for the other people. This simultaneous duality. They're just one of them more or less accords with our intuitive understanding of the world more, and the other one less, but both are maintained. So relating to this person is not relating on one level or relating at one level after another. It's relating simultaneously on different kinds of level. And this sort of reminds me, you know, of an awful lot of sort of social theory. I mean, one of the things that's going on in an awful lot of social theory is that you get this sort of funny oscillation, as you probably know, between kinds of theories which one might call anti-naturalist theories, where, you know, that's sort of basically starting with Durkheim. And Durkheim says, you know, look at society, you think it's made up of individuals who are interacting together and just sort of playing the game of the social. But that way of thinking is completely wrong, says Durkheim. I mean, that's his starting point. Because you can't start with people, because people are being constructed in terms of a system of representations. So you can't sort of compare the social system place A and the social system in place B, as though they were two manifestations of organizations of the same the same entities, people. People are being constructed there, no such thing as men or women. Men and women are being constructed within systems of meaning, sort of Geertzian kind of notion, and that really everything is taken off in human society. Human societies can only exist via the system of representation of the people who are being talked about. And since these systems of representation are different here and there, there is no sort of natural basis to sociology. Now, that kind of position is the common position, I would say, at least in anthropology. And it becomes dominant, it's the social structure kind of theories, but it's also the Durkheimian theories, it's the Geertzian theories, it's the idea, people are being constructed through narratives and so on. So that's one type of theory. And then from time to time people say, come off it. And that recurs again and again. And they say, come off it. People are people. This is all just sort of thin, sort of wafer stuff which sort of floats over it. But the reality is that there are people who are negotiating with each other, pushing and pulling, in a kind of Machiavellian kind of game. That's the kind of theory that one associates, with what used to be called transactionalism in social theory, or people who sort of try to look at society in terms of game theory, and so on. And the history of social science has been, one or the other of these views. One represented as naturalist, the other one's anti-naturalist, as a matter of fact. Just coming in and out, rather like you've got these two figures in old barometers, you had one with sunshine would come out, and then the one with the umbrella had to go in when the one with sunshine came out, and then vice versa when the depression came along. And that's really more or less the history of social science. Now, there are obvious sort of problems with this. I mean, there's a problem, there's sort of epistemological problem, that the kind of constructivist notion is obviously just as natural as the others. I mean, it's not floating in midair. It somehow has to exist in some sort of reality, both cognitive and material, and that therefore it might appear as though we might be suspended in sort of webs of meaning that we ourselves have created, or we're not. And there's also a problem with the other one, that also is no more natural either, in the sense that we're dealing with the phenomenology, posh word, of social life in terms of how the world is being experienced. Otherwise, you can't really understand what's going on. Be even true if you're talking about ants. But so the opposition is misleading itself. But still, the opposition is what social science has been like, as though one had to choose between the two alternatives. But now, if you think back on the example I was giving you, this old man, you can probably see that they're not really alternatives. If human beings can be playing at two games at the same time, if they're simultaneously playing two games at the same time, the oscillation between those two positions, and saying two is a gross oversimplification, is wrong. You see, there is a way in which you can say that the old man is at one moment part of a kind of realist, naturalist society where he's seen as a sort of weak old man, and people treat him in terms of a weak old man. So game theory works there. You know, he's totally nothing else but what he can do in the game. And then or you can see him as this elder as part of this mysterious floating system of construction through narratives or whatever. And so one has to choose between one and the other, but we don't have to choose between one and the other, because we're dealing with a kind of animal, human beings, who start off as small kids, who already from 18 months are already handling the possibility of being in two systems at the same time. Now, of course, one system, I would argue further, can only exist as a kind of transformation of another. And indeed, one can see this if one looks at the development of children. So I was saying, you know, the child has to be a sort of hard-nosed rationalist before she can play at pretend playing. That's why, you know, the sort of Piagetian or Freudian system is so wrong. They were sort of assuming, you know, the child has to be is sort of floating in a semi-magical world, and then sort of works things out in a sensible way. It's actually exactly the other way around. So the point I'm saying is that when we try to think of the social, we mustn't think of it as a system. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons why we shouldn't think of it as a system. But one of the reasons which I want to stress here is the reason why we shouldn't think of it as a system is because it is many systems simultaneously. We are ourselves being simultaneously different kinds of things, and we are in relationship to other people simultaneously in different kinds of things. So this kind of opposition between these two kinds of sort of social theories, which have been sort of floating around, turns out to be a kind of refusal to understand just how complex our capacities are. It's as though, you know, we're asking somebody who's using a metaphor to say, well, what do you really mean? It's a stupid question to ask, because obviously the very nature of the metaphor is that you mean two things at the same time. What do you really mean when you're being ironic? Well, obviously you're being two things at the same time. Who are you when you're citing somebody else? Are you the person, you know, what are you doing there if you're telling me what the other person has said? You know, are you disappearing as soon as you start to say, Mary told me that she was going shopping, and then reappearing at the end of the citation? No. You're both there in that way. So this is why I think that pretend play is so interesting, because first of all it tells us something about the kind of animal that we are, who has a kind of cognitive capacity that we have. And this is very, very different from, for example, if you look at chimpanzees. If you look at chimpanzees, societies, there's good descriptions, for example. If you look at a dominant animal in a chimpanzee society, if you look at Sir Franz de Waal's description in his book, Chimpanzee Politics, you get dominant animals, and they're not, you know, as a sort of film view of a dominant animal, you know, the one who can just hit harder, that makes them the dominant one. Actually, dominant chimpanzees are clever manipulators. strategic, Machiavellian animals, sort of building up little alliances and little, and sort of playing tricks and lying and so on. But as soon as they lose out in the game, as soon as they lose out in the Machiavellian game, which has enabled them to become dominant, it also doesn't matter the fact they can hit harder, but that's another issue. But as soon as they lose out in the Machiavellian game, that's it. Within a minute, they're not a dominant animal anymore. I mean, chimpanzees do bow to each other in a way very similar to the kind of gesture, I was showing to you for the way people go in front of Marius the Elder. But they would never do it to a weak, useless, semi-senile animal. He's out. Completely out, you see. So, in a sense, chimpanzees can't maintain this duality, this multiplicity, this simultaneous multiplicity which human beings can do, and which human beings can do from the age of 18 months. So it's not very. So when you're thinking back on the kinds of things which the Tomasello team have been showing, you can see that it's not just the fact that human beings are into much more complex social systems, is that they're into these multiplex, simultaneous, multi-level, going on at the same time social systems which depend on the very nature of their cognitive abilities, which we've seen have developed even before they can learn to speak. So, I'm arguing that there's a direct connection between the kind of societies which one can observe in Madagascar and anywhere else, and these kinds of, and this kind of pretend play. There's indeed a connection with the difficulties which social scientists have in building up theories, and that we can then go back to the original question of why is it that human beings, through the course of human evolution, have evolved that capacity of simultaneous representations. Well, I would agree with those people who said it prepares you for the social. That this is what sort of people working with Mike Tomasello have argued. But you need to be much more precise. It doesn't just prepare you for the very, very complicated, for an ever more complicated social. It prepares you for a social that can occur simultaneously at multiple levels, where you can then use rhetoric using irony and metaphors and citations, where indeed in wild games with this kind of thing, you can have things like spirit possession. And so basically that's the basic thing I want to say. But since I've still got another quarter of an hour, let me just mention one other little intriguing fact, which I've just been learning about just very recently. And that is, the way I sort of tend to think of it, and the kind of argument that I've been putting in front of you, which in fact I've also begun to publish a bit, but in ways which I'm slightly sorry about, because I think there are mistakes in the way I presented it. But I just do this contrast, you see, between this dominant animal who loses out, who is not multiple, who is not simultaneously multiple. The chimpanzee, dominant chimpanzee, is not simultaneously multiple. So if he loses out in the Machiavellian game, that's it, he's lost out. And the human elder, who can maintain his elderhood when he's a sort of weak, senile animal. So we could sort of say at the end, brilliant. That's where we found why we're so much cleverer than chimpanzees, because we've developed this much more complicated type of social organization. That's the sort of basic view in an awful lot of evolutionary theory. But I've even added another little bit of thing we can be proud about. It's this multiplicity of elements. But my latest little problem in this kind of argument is stuff that I've been reading about wolves. Now, wolves are very interesting because, as you know, they are the ancestors of dogs. And dogs are very interesting because they're man's best friend. Yes, dogs are man's best friend, it's not horses, isn't it? And one of the reasons why they're man's best friend is because very complex social pragmatic interactions can exist between dogs and humans, which probably if any of you have ever had dogs will know. Now, that's a fact. And the usual explanation of why is it that dogs can entertain these extremely subtle pragmatic interactions with humans is because through the co-evolution of humans and dogs through time, they've both had to sort of somehow accord their mental capacities in order to get on with them. You know, humans who couldn't get on with dogs didn't sort of reproduce much. Dogs which didn't get on with humans didn't do it either. And so kind of the normal processes of social, natural selection took place. So we get landed with humans which can coordinate with dogs, and dogs which can coordinate with humans. Well, that's fair enough, but one of the questions is why that particular animal has been chosen. And indeed, one of the things which is interesting, I don't know if some of you know this, but that it looks as though there's been lots of failures with other animals of trying to establish this kind of cross-species interaction. And now there's been a suggestion that, not a very fairly obvious one if you think about it, is that the reason why this sort of cooperation started is because, in the first place, wolves, the ancestors of dogs, were pretty clever in the first place, and therefore, you know, they're all right. There's been changes since they've been domesticated, but there was a good start. You know, they were jolly good animals to start off with. And one of the features, and that you can show that if you look at wolf social organization, which is very, very complex, indeed much more complex than that of chimpanzees. Wolf packs have very, very complex social organization. And they have leaders, dominant animals, if you like. But what really worried me about it, when I was reading about this, is that they carry on respecting dominant animals after they've gone weak and senile. In other words, you know, I was trying to draw a kind of opposition between chimpanzees and humans, and saying that humans have this extra element which you can see in the fact that there's a possibility of there being an elder like there is in the Malagasy village that I'm talking about. So that's us above chimps, something we picked up sometime since we separated off from chimps. So there's them lot animals, there's us lot humans. But then you find certain animals which seem to be doing at least in one little element, some of the same sorts of things as humans, who are genetically infinitely more distant from us than our chimpanzees. So, well, obviously it's a problem for what I've been saying, but not that much of a problem, because quite a lot of people have been arguing recently that if indeed the kind of cognitive capacities that we have is linked with the capacity, with the complexity of the kind of society that we have, then you're going to get very subtle intelligence in other species, which may be genetically quite distant from us, but which we're going to have to cope with the same social, or similar, not the same, but similar social complexity as us, of which wolves would be an example. And then immediately other animals sort of come to mind. Dolphins with an equally similarly complex social, well, with also a very complex social organization. And I don't know if any of you know in this university, Nikki Clayton's work on crows, and, which also seem to be amazingly clever in many ways. And also this seems to be linked with other animals with extraordinarily complex social organization. You might be able to be doing, I don't know, you might find the dominant crows, actually I don't know if crows have quite dominant the same sort of thing, the same kind of ability to handle at the same time similar, to have social relations which are simultaneously of a different sort at the same time. Right, that's it. See, you don't have to shut me up.
If I may ask a question of my own and then open it up to the audience, but you're in a better position to take audience questions.
Why don't you come here then? See.
Okay, then I'll put myself up then. No, my question really is a theoretical question, which is looking at the two schools of theory you're saying. One is sort of social structure, the other is constructivism. And near the twain shall meet in this social barometer which you were talking about. I'm wondering why theory has had such difficulty in accepting this multiplicity over time.
Well, I mean, first of all, social structure and constructivism is the same thing. Right. What I'm opposing it to is the sort of transactionalist, individual kind of manipulative, sort of Gale theory kind of model. And I think, in fact, I think it's very funny. I mean, for me, all the sort of constructivist stuff is just a sort of very similar to the sort of Durkheimian social structure kind of tradition, which has a lot to say, but it's opposed to the other. Why has it been so difficult to put them together? Is because I think probably because of writing in terms of, I think a lot of it has to do with sort of thinking in terms of systems. So it's very difficult to think, to write with the kind of complexity which the human brain has given us. It seems to me actually that a lot of social science just can't cope with just how clever we are. And that's an example of it, you see. I mean,
unfortunately it wasn't me.
And that's the, and I actually could even give other examples. Perhaps, you know, an example of just how difficult is why you get ridiculous theories like those of Freud when he was looking at infants, of thinking, gosh, they must be in a total muddle, which is very odd. I mean, you know, I don't know if Freud ever looked at an infant living in this sort of semi-magical world where nothing is clear and so on. It just seems to be that we do seem to have in our theory building a problem with this extraordinary capacities that we have, but not just us, but wolves also perhaps.
Yeah, I was wondering if that ties in with, for example, the work of Anne-Marie Mollins, the ontological arguments regarding a very complex epistemology, but one which sort of seems to have a singularity of causal logic as well, sort of tied into it. that makes sense.
It makes sense, but it shows up my ignorance.
Okay.
Because I've never heard of this person talking about it.
Okay, fair enough. Can we take questions from the floor?
Hi, I was interested, sort of you had the game theory side and then the constructivist side. But in game theory, one of the big things in game theory is deception. And I was wondering if deception itself doesn't tie into this idea of having a sort of duality of two things at once, or is that something separate? And the second thing I wanted to find out was, why does it seem so counterintuitive to us that you can have this split in the first place? I mean, when we were presenting the evidence at first, if we do it all the time, which I think we do, it would see much more evidence of this.
First of all, your thing about deception. I mean, it seems to me that deception is a single level theory, and indeed deception goes on in chimpanzee society, and it does in human society. But that's not so interesting. Indeed, if you look at an awful lot of evolutionary psychology, they're obsessed by deception. They don't actually pay much attention to the kind of phenomena that I've been talking about, because they're sort of imagining as a kind of human beings as though they are in game theory at a single level of the game. You know, that it's not that there are many games going on at the same time. But secondly, why is it so difficult? I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that why is it that people haven't really looked, paid more attention to pretend play? I think part of the explanation is that it's only until very recently that people have thought that looking at children is interesting at all, especially very young children. There's actually very little in literature, even now, on pretend play. And also, it's fairly recent, this kind of very systematic comparison that people like the Leipzig log have been doing, which brings into focus those very clear differences that there is in the development of chimps and humans. I mean, there's many problems in what they do, but still, when you there's some suggestion that there's a bit of pretend play in other primates, but even if that was right, it's absolutely minute, you know, compared to a child. I mean, I don't know if you have kids, but it's a major occupation. It's interesting that sort of girls do it more than boys, and there are interesting problems and theories about how it links up with theory of mind and stuff like that. But I think, you know, the simple answer to your question, why isn't there much? I mean, it's a jolly good handle to think about that. Pretend playing, but people haven't really looked much at these kids. It's funny, I mean, there's so many, quite a lot of anthropologists and social scientists have children.
Yeah, well, thank you. You were asking about, or talking about very young children, so I'd like to ask a question about young children, particularly the idea of mothering as that occurs across species, because, I mean, my knowledge of animal psychology is not extensive, but from what I've gathered, there's a number of cases where animals seem to experience concern if their baby is sick, or experience some kind of mourning or pining if it dies. In fact, there's examples of animal bereavement even at older levels, and so on some level you have maybe some kind of doubling going on there, in that you have a sense of the child being sick and needing help, but also some sense of what it used to be and what it could be, and almost some kind of temporal trajectory that means that the parent keeps sort of supporting the child despite the fact that sort of rationally or on a kind of game theory level it would be to its advantage to just let it die. So I was wondering how your model dealt with that, given that that's a predicament that does go across almost all species, and whether or not that was a productive line to think about.
Yeah, but isn't it fairly straightforward? I mean, you know, I mean, there's nothing very complicated, surely, about an adult animal being worried about a juvenile, especially a related juvenile sickness. I mean, that doesn't really seem to involve any kind of complication and multiplication of levels, does it?
Well, but why should it be concerned if it's concerned about the juvenile and then not concerned about more adult individuals?
Well,
or why should there be that kind of...
Very simple sociobiological answer to that. I mean, you know, it's sort of... one could assume, you know, that evolution has bred into animals a concern with their offspring. You begin to have more complicated things that they're concerned with any old offspring, but their own offspring, it becomes rather easy to explain. I mean, why is it that perhaps you're thinking that you get these mothers, I think, who carry on sort of nursing dead children.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if I could explain it. It seems to me quite a different question. I don't think it's very difficult to explain why that would be so.
But do you think it could not indicate similar kinds of cognitive capacity?
No, I wouldn't have thought it does. Not similar ones. I mean.
I was wondering about an example you gave about possession. You said when people look at the possessed people, they see the separate and the person. So from the possessed person's side, wouldn't you say that they are only one, they are only separate? So unlike humans and similar to chimpanzees, they can't cope with maintaining two registers at the same time.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, if you look at literature on possession, I mean, people say, you know, when I'm possessed, I am Prince Archibald or whatever. I am not myself there. Of course, it's very difficult to know exactly what's going on in their mind when this is taking place. But I think it's clear when you're looking at other people looking at them. They see Prince Archibald and the medium there. I mean, there's been, you know, in sort of possessions, in the study of possession, a kind of oscillation of theories, which actually reflects the kind of oscillation of theories that I was talking about. You know, the people who said, oh, well, it's all rubbish. You know, possession is just a big fraud. It's the medium. It's the medium who's there. And perhaps they can trick a few other people to believe they're not there. Or on the other hand, you know, the reaction against this sort of theories being people saying, you must take seriously what people are saying to you. They're saying, look, Prince Archibald is there and he's talking to me, he's giving me advice, which I think is probably a better move, you know, rather than denying the very phenomena that we're trying to study. But I think it's not a very convincing one if you actually look at what's happening. People are aware both of the medium and of the spirit, both co-present. I have a feeling, very difficult, I don't know what kind of ethnography I could give to show that that's so. But I think you'd find that most people who studied spirit possession probably would agree with me.
But because they're not pretending there, so they're not keeping the two. I mean, if you think they are not.
No, it's just we have no problem. We have no
Yeah.
problem in dealing with somebody who is different kinds of things at different levels, I think. You see, what I'm really saying is that the kind of problems that we've made for ourselves only exist if we undervalue our cognitive capacity. If we bear in mind we have the cognitive capacities to at the same time consider another individual as existing in different kinds of systems at the same time, which, you know, the fact that there is pretend play, the fact that there is irony and so on, shows that we can, then you know, the either-or problem goes away.
Okay, would you like to?
Thanks. So if we do have, if we recognise that we have this capacity of having different representations at the same time, sort of double think, then what kind of social theory do you think this realisation is going to lead up to?
I mean, I think obviously, I'm not quite sure is the answer. I mean, it first of all enables us to probably drop many of the problems which different types of social theories have got stuck over. It, I think also, I would say, is that it shows that you cannot have a social theory which doesn't take seriously the cognitive capacities of human beings. And in many ways, you know, I'm sort of caricaturing the two opposite sides. But one thing one could say is that go to the two extremes, you know, sort of Geertzian kind of view versus a sort of game theory kind of view. One of the things that they share in common is a lack of consideration of the nature of human cognitive capacity. Sorry. Oh, lovely.
I should have told you about it before.
You did tell me about it before you broke the whole thing.
Can I take a question from Gregory as well?
Thank you. I wanted to ask you if prison play was always a journalistic process, or if one could imagine multiple roles to be held simultaneously by the same person. And the second question is, if it is always dualistic, as your example seems to show, then why?
I mean, the first answer is that I've been talking about pretend play in very young children. It goes on and gets more and more and more complicated.